Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now. I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you're the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar logistics company.
Right, okay.
And you've got these massive international supply chains, thousands of independent contractors on the payroll, and, highly volatile profit margins.
Very stressful job.
Oh, incredibly stressful. So it's a Tuesday morning, and you just found out your primary supplier shorted you on 2 tons of vital product.
Oh, wow.
Right. But here's the catch. You cannot sue them.
No lawsuits.
None. You can't, call the police to report a theft. You don't have an HR department to handle any internal disputes. And you certainly don't have a legal team to draft a breach of contract notice or anything like that.
You're completely on your own.
Completely. And if you don't resolve this by Friday, your entire enterprise collapses. So how do you enforce the rules of your business?
Well, you enforce them by establishing a localized, highly credible system of physical consequence. You basically have to build a parallel justice system.
Exactly. Welcome to the boardroom of global organized crime. Today, we are completely rewiring how we think about the mob, the cartel, and the syndicate in this deep dive.
It's going to be a big one.
It really is. I want you, the listener, to take that cinematic image you have in your head right now, the dimly lit Italian restaurant, the cigar smoke, the pathological killers operating on some mystical ancient blood oath, and just throw it right out the window.
Yeah, you have to. Because the cinematic illusion, it's compelling, right? But it entirely obscures the actual mechanics of how these organizations survive day to day.
Right. They aren't just sitting around brooding.
No, not at all. If we want to understand the reality, we have to replace that romanticized back room with a sterile corporate whiteboard.
A whiteboard with org charts and everything.
Exactly. Org charts, supply chain logistics, and the economics of private governance. Because underneath all that Hollywood filter, organized crime is fundamentally a highly structured, profoundly rational economic institution. They are trying to solve the exact same management problems as any Fortune 500 company.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are going to strip away the moral panic today and just look at the structural data.
Just the mechanics.
Right. We're breaking down the why and the how behind everything from the origins of the Sicilian Cosa Nostra to the fragmented warfare of Mexican cartels, all the way up to the modern Russian state.
It's a massive geographic spread, but the underlying rules are the same.
Yeah, and to do that, we really have to start with a foundational premise that, honestly, it shifted my entire perspective on this topic when we started prepping for this deep dive.
The Gambetta thesis.
Yes, it's this idea from Diego Gambetta's 1993 book, The Sicilian Mafia, The Business of Private Protection. It's the idea that organized crime doesn't actually produce anything.
Yeah, it's a massive paradigm shift. Because we typically conceptualize criminal syndicates as manufacturers or smugglers of illicit goods, right?
Like drugs, weapons, contraband. We think they make it and sell it.
Exactly. But the core economic analysis reveals that the mafia, at least in its purest form, is a service provider. They don't produce the goods. They produce and sell protection.
Protection. Okay, so if I'm understanding this, if I'm smuggling a truckload of contraband across a border, the cartel isn't necessarily the one driving the truck or, cooking the product in a lab.
Not necessarily, no.
I am paying them for the guarantee that the truck won't be hijacked by a rival gang and that the buyer on the other side will actually hand over the cash when I get there.
Precisely. You're buying certainty. They are selling the guarantee that contracts will be honored, that debts are paid, and property rights are respected.
Because I don't have the legal system to do that for me.
Right. In a legitimate economy, the state holds the monopoly on contract enforcement. Think about it. If a bakery pays for a shipment of flour and the supplier delivers sawdust instead, what happens?
The bakery owner takes them to civil court.
Exactly. The state enforces the transaction. But if you remove the state from that equation, either because the transaction is illegal to begin with, or because the state itself is profoundly corrupt and inefficient, the demand for that contract enforcement doesn't just vanish.
Right. I still need my flour. And I still need to know I'm not going to get ripped off.
Nature abhors a vacuum.
It really does.
Yeah.
If the legal system won't guarantee my transaction, a shadow system will inevitably spring up to offer that exact service.
And that shadow system is the mafia. They provide the infrastructural trust required for commerce to occur in environments where formal governance has just completely failed.
They step right into the institutional void.
They do.
Which I think brings us to the violence, because this is the part people get hung up on. If I hire a private arbitration firm in the legal world, they use a legally binding subpoena to force compliance. But the mafia obviously doesn't have subpoenas. So if I'm getting this right, the violence we see, which pop culture always portrays as these guys just being unhinged, bloodthirsty sociopaths, it's actually a calculated administrative tool.
The violence is entirely instrumental. It's not a hobby, it's a tool. Think about the product they are selling.
Protection and dispute resolution.
Right. The entire value of that product rests on the credibility of their threat. If a syndicate cannot impose severe, unavoidable consequences for a breach of contract or a failure to pay, then their protection is worthless.
Because nobody would be scared of them.
Exactly. The violence is not a departure from their business logic. It is the fundamental enforcement mechanism that sustains their market value. It's their version of a subpoena.
So the guy breaking legs with a baseball bat isn't having a psychotic break?
No.
He's serving a corporate function. He is basically the physical manifestation of a late fee or an asset seizure.
That's a great way to put it.
Because if the syndicate looks weak, or if they let someone get away with skipping a payment, they lose their pricing power in the protection market.
It's the exact equivalent of a central bank losing control of inflation.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Confidence in the currency collapses. If a mafia family fails to enforce its rules violently, confidence in their protection collapses. Competitors move in, clients stop paying tribute, and the organization dissolves.
So the violence has to be extreme to maintain the monopoly. I want you, the listener, to think about how often you rely on the invisible safety net of the law.
It's everywhere.
It is. Every time you swipe a credit card, sign a lease for an apartment, or even just buy a used car off Craigslist, you are implicitly trusting that a vast legal apparatus will back you up if the other party tries to cheat you.
You don't even think about it.
Right. Imagine if that net just vanished at midnight tonight.
Chaos.
Absolute chaos. By tomorrow morning, you would be actively seeking alternative guarantees just to keep your business running or your family safe.
And to see how that alternative guarantee system was historically perfected into an actual economic model, we don't have to look at abstract theories. We can look at 19th century Sicily.
Ah, the birthplace of the Cosa Nostra.
Yes, specifically in the decades following the unification of Italy.
But it's important to note, it didn't emerge because of some inherent cultural flaw in Sicily, right? It emerged out of a very specific socioeconomic perfect storm.
A complete systemic shock.
So let's set the stage. We are looking at a post-feudal society. For centuries, the feudal lords were the absolute law.
They were the state.
Right, they held the land, they had the private armies, they resolved the disputes. But suddenly, feudalism collapses.
The transition was incredibly chaotic.
Yeah.
You have the new Italian state attempting to assert control, but they are viewed as a foreign occupying force by the rural Sicilian population.
They didn't trust the new government at all.
Not one bit. The state police are weak, heavily distrusted, and entirely incapable of enforcing property rights. So you have a massive institutional vacuum in what is primarily an agrarian economy.
And sitting right in the crosshairs of this vacuum are a class of people called the gabellati.
The gabellati. They were essentially middle managers.
Okay, middle managers of the farmlands.
Yeah, they were entrepreneurial tenant farmers. They leased massive agricultural estates from absentee aristocrats who preferred living in luxury in Palermo or Naples.
Right, the lords don't want to be in the dirt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the gabellati's job was to manage the land, hire the peasant labor, and ensure that harvest was brought to market so they could pay their lease and keep the profit.
But they are trying to do this in an environment of extreme poverty, right? Like massive social unrest and zero police presence.
Zero.
The peasants working the land are starving. They hate the absentee landlords. And they probably hate the gabellati even more because they're the ones cracking the whip.
They despise them. Peasant uprisings, crop theft, and vandalism were daily threats.
So the gabellati desperately needed security.
They needed someone to enforce their property rights.
Yeah.
They needed to ensure the peasants didn't just walk off with the entire citrus harvest.
And the market supplied a solution.
It always does. Following the various wars of Italian unification, Sicily was suddenly flooded with decommissioned soldiers, former mercenaries, and rural bandits.
A lot of guys with guns and no jobs.
Exactly. These were men with extensive combat experience and no formal employment.
So it's direct supply and demand equation. The Gablotti demand violent enforcement to protect their profit margins, and the former soldiers supply that violence.
It's basic economics. Yep. The Gablotti start hiring these armed squads to guard the estates, intimidate the labor force, and secure the transport of goods to the ports.
And very quickly, I imagine, those armed squads realized they held all the leverage.
Oh, almost immediately.
Yeah.
What's fascinating here is they transitioned from being hired security guards to becoming completely autonomous protection syndicates.
They flipped the script.
They did. They started extorting the very Gablotti who hired them, essentially saying, pay us a percentage of your harvest, or we won't just stop protecting you. We will be the ones burning your fields.
Wow. This is the genesis of the Cosa Nostra.
Right there.
And structurally, they organized themselves into territorial monopolies. Each mafia family, or casca, laid claim to a specific town or geographic sector.
Yes.
I want to drill down into why the monopoly aspect is so vital. Because if I'm a business owner, a free market is usually good for me, right? Competition drives down prices. Why doesn't the protection market work that way?
Because in the market of illicit protection, competition actively destroys the credibility of the product.
How so?
Let's say you own a citrus grove in a town where two rival mafia families are operating. Family A offers to protect you for 10% of your profits. Family B comes in and offers to protect you for 5%.
As a business owner, I want the 5% deal, obviously.
But if Family B cannot violently expel Family A from the town, they are demonstrating weakness. If they can't even protect their own territorial claim against a rival syndicate, how can they possibly guarantee the protection of your citrus grove against thieves?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. The presence of a competitor inherently proves that the protector's threat of violence is not absolute.
Exactly. A protector who tolerates competition is a protector who lacks capability.
So they have to establish monopolies, which inevitably leads to violent turf wars until only one family controls a given area.
Which is incredibly costly. War disrupts commerce, kills valuable human capital, and draws the attention of the state police.
It's bad for business.
Very bad. To solve this inefficiency, by the 1950s, the Sicilian mafia established the Commissiona.
The commission. We've all heard of that from the movies. It's literally a corporate board of directors, isn't it?
It functions exactly like a cartel board, in the economic sense of the word cartel, like OPEC. The heads of the major families met to mediate territorial disputes, divide up public works contracts, and regulate the use of violence.
They created an overarching governance structure to prevent costly internal competition.
Precisely.
And that internal governance brings us to one of the most misunderstood concepts in pop culture, which is omerta.
Oh, yes. The code of silence.
Right. We are always shown omerta as this deeply mystical, pseudo-religious vow, pricking fingers, burning saint cards, swearing blood loyalty.
It's very cinematic.
Very. But if we are viewing this organization as a corporation, omerta serves a completely mundane practical function. Mathematically, it is just an NDA, right?
Sure.
A non-disclosure agreement.
It is the ultimate violently enforced NDA. Consider the fundamental structural vulnerability of a criminal syndicate. They cannot utilize the state's legal system to resolve their internal corporate disputes.
Right, like a mafia boss cannot file a lawsuit against his underboss for embezzlement.
No.
He can't call a labor board if his soldiers threaten to strike.
Consequently, the organization has to be completely insulated from the formal legal system. If an underboss feels slighted over a financial dispute and has the option to simply walk into a local police precinct, testify, and leverage the state apparatus to remove his boss,
The whole thing falls apart.
the entire shadow governance structure collapses. Omerta is the institutional firewall against that.
It's their substitute for an HR department. It's the internal regulatory mechanism.
And it relies on the exact same logic as their external protection racket. The credible threat of overwhelming violence.
You don't stay silent because of a mystical blood oath. You stay silent because the corporate policy for breach of contract is the execution of you and your family.
The ritualism, the burning saints and the blood oaths, that's just the corporate branding.
Branding, I love that.
It's the onboarding process designed to instill a sense of elite exclusivity and psychological commitment. But the underlying mechanics are purely practical. It is an institutional necessity for a firm operating outside the law.
Okay, so Sicily gives us this brilliant blueprint of what happens when a state is too weak to govern its territory, creating a localized vacuum.
Yes.
But what happens when a powerful, highly functional state intentionally creates a nationwide vacuum by outlawing a product that its population absolutely refuses to give up?
Then you get the most significant natural experiment in the history of illicit economics, the American Prohibition era from 1920 to 1933.
The Volstead Act. The government actually amends the Constitution to ban the manufacture and sale of alcohol.
A massive intervention.
Huge. But here's the critical economic reality. Passing a law does not erase consumer demand. Millions of Americans still wanted to go to a bar after a long shift.
The demand remained perfectly inelastic.
Yeah.
But the supply side experienced a traumatic shock. Every legitimate brewery, distillery, and logistics company was forced out of the market overnight.
The tap was turned off.
Legally, yes. The supply of alcohol shifted entirely and instantaneously into the hands of criminal operators.
And this introduces a concept that dictates the economics of every illicit market. The risk premium.
The risk premium is everything.
Let's break that down. If I'm brewing beer legally before 1920, my overhead is just grain, glass bottles, and transport, right?
Standard business expenses.
But if I'm brewing it in 1925, my overhead includes the very real risk of federal prison, my inventory being smashed by axes, or getting gunned down by a rival bootlegger.
To justify taking on those massive physical and legal risks, the criminal supplier must pass that cost on to the consumer. They charge a massive risk premium.
So the price of alcohol skyrockets.
It explodes. And because there is zero legitimate competition to undercut them, profit margins in the criminal underworld just expanded to levels that are difficult to comprehend.
We're talking about small neighborhood street gangs, guys who were previously running localized numbers rackets or petty extortion, suddenly managing the cash flow of a mid-sized nation.
The sheer scale of capital accumulation completely changed the structural nature of American crime.
How so?
With that unprecedented liquidity, they began to operate like modern venture capitalists. They didn't just hoard the cash in mattresses, they invested it. They built vast transcontinental logistics networks.
Oh, like boats and trucks.
Fleets of speedboats, trucks, massive warehouses, and most importantly, they diversified their portfolios.
So they took bootlegging profits and moved into loan sharking, illegal casinos, labor racketeering.
Exactly. They started infiltrating legitimate industries, like the garment district or waste management in New York, using their violent enforcement mechanisms to create artificial monopolies in legal markets.
But to protect an enterprise of that scale, you cannot simply hide from the state. You have to integrate with it.
You have to co-opt it. The Prohibition-era syndicates used their massive revenues to systematically corrupt the very institutions designed to police them. They bought off beat cops, precinct captains, judges, and mayors.
And this integration was heavily defined by the ethnic geography of American cities at the time, right?
Very much so.
You look at the organizations emerging, the Italian-American Cosa Nostra, the Jewish syndicates led by figures like Meyer Lansky, the Irish mobs, black policy bankers in Chicago and Harlem, Chinese tongs. Why did these illicit corporations organize so strictly along ethnic lines?
It comes down to the problem of trust in an environment without legal recourse. If you are coordinating a multi-million-dollar smuggling operation and you cannot rely on written contracts or courts, who do you trust not to steal the money or betray you to the police?
You rely on pre-existing social networks.
Exactly. You hire the guy from your neighborhood who speaks your parents' language, whose family goes to your church, and who faces the exact same societal exclusion that you do.
Because these immigrant communities were largely ghettoized and locked out of the mainstream American economy.
The ethnic enclave provided a dense web of social ties, marriages, shared culture, shared geography that functioned as collateral.
Collateral. That's a great word for it.
If a soldier betrayed the syndicate, he wasn't just fired. He was excommunicated from his entire social world.
His family would disown him.
Right. Which perfectly explains their symbiosis with the urban political machines of the era.
Like Tammany Hall in New York or the Democratic machine in Chicago.
Yes. These political machines relied heavily on immigrant votes to stay in power. They provided social services, Thanksgiving turkeys, municipal jobs in exchange for loyalty at the ballot box.
And the syndicates became the enforcers and financiers of that political system.
The mob provided the political bosses with massive infusions of illicit campaign cash. They used their control of labor unions to manage strikes, often through brute force, to benefit politically connected businesses.
And on election day, they quite literally secured the vote through intimidation and fraud.
It was an ecosystem. The politicians provided the syndicates with immunity from prosecution, and the syndicates provided the politicians with the capital and muscle to maintain power.
This systemic integration led criminologists like Robert Merton and Daniel Bell to develop what's known as the functionalist argument.
A very controversial but important sociological lens.
Right. They analyzed this era and posited that organized crime actually served a vital, albeit illicit, social function. I find this theory fascinating because it almost frames the mob as a social justice mechanism. Merton and Bell basically argued that because the legitimate avenues of the American dream, getting a bank loan, climbing the corporate ladder, joining a country club, were systematically blocked by intense prejudice for Italians, Jews, and the Irish organized crime provided a queer ladder of social mobility.
That was Bell's exact phrasing. The queer ladder. If you couldn't access formal banking, the local syndicate boss was your venture capitalist. The syndicate provided a fast track to wealth, local prestige, and eventually a way to launder that money into legitimate respectability for the next generation.
So Merton and Bell are saying organized crime was almost like an aggressive illegal jobs program for marginalized immigrants.
In a structural sense, yeah.
Here's where it gets really interesting. That sounds almost noble. But aren't we ignoring the victims here? Doesn't it completely sanitize the reality of who is actually paying the price for that mobility?
You've hit on the critical flaw in the functionalist perspective. It accurately maps the sociology of the trust networks and the political integration, but it dangerously obscures the sheer trauma inflicted on the host communities.
Right.
The wealth generated by these syndicate bosses did not primarily come from victimless crimes like selling Canadian whiskey to rich socialites.
It came from predatory extortion.
Precisely. They preyed voraciously on their own communities. The local grocery store might have gotten a loan, but they were also forced to pay ruinous weekly protection money.
And if they couldn't pay, their store was bombed.
The labor racketeering depressed wages for immigrant workers while enriching the syndicate bosses who colluded with management. The ladder of social mobility for a handful of mobsters was constructed on the financial ruin and physical terrorization of their own working-class neighbors.
It's a sobering reality check. But I want a listener to really put themselves in the shoes of a newly arrived immigrant in a 1920s tenement. You are entirely ignored by the city government, barred from legitimate employment, and surrounded by this incredibly powerful, wealthy shadow state on your street corner. You can entirely understand the structural gravity that pulled people into that orbit, regardless of its legality.
It reinforces the central thesis: organized crime is the symptom of an institutional failure.
So what happens when Prohibition ends?
Well, when Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, the state reasserted control over the alcohol market. The risk premium evaporated, the profit margins vanished, and the bootlegging empires collapsed.
But the infrastructure didn't just vanish?
No, the logistics networks, the political corruption, the violent enforcement mechanisms, they didn't disappear.
They just pivoted. They had the corporate machinery. They just needed a new high-margin product.
And by the 1970s, the global economy provided one.
Yeah.
The focus shifted entirely to international drug trafficking.
And the underlying economic equation remained identical, right?
Identical. A highly demanded product is criminalized by a strong state, creating a massive risk premium and transferring supply to organizations capable of violent contract enforcement.
Right.
But what changed was the sheer geopolitical scale.
We are scaling up to industrial extremes now. We're moving from the neighborhood extortion rackets of the American mob to the sovereign-level power of the global drug cartels.
It's a completely different magnitude.
Let's start with the Colombian model. When we look at the Medellin cartel under Pablo Escobar, or the Cali cartel, we are looking at vertically integrated multinational conglomerates.
Vertical integration is the key concept here. In corporate terms, it means a single firm controls every single stage of its supply chain.
From top to bottom.
The Colombian cartels achieve this on a staggering scale. They financed the cultivation of coca leaves in the Andes. They built massive industrial-scale chemical processing laboratories deep in the Amazonian jungle.
Think about the logistics of that for a second. Building a factory is hard enough in a legal economy. How do you import industrial generators, tons of acetone and ether, and heavy manufacturing equipment into a trackless jungle without tipping off the government or leaving a paper trail?
You have to build a complete shadow logistics network.
Unbelievable.
They constructed private airstrips, purchased fleets of transport planes, and eventually engineered custom-built semi-submersible submarines to bypass the U.S. Coast Guard.
They were building submarines.
Yes. They controlled the wholesale distribution hubs in Miami and Los Angeles. They internalized the entire process from the soil to the street corner.
And the capital generated by this vertical integration is almost unfathomable. At its peak in the 1980s, the Medellin cartel was estimated to be generating billions of dollars annually in liquid cash.
When a shadow corporation generates that level of revenue, they transcend traditional political corruption.
They aren't just bribing a local judge anymore.
No, they are purchasing the state apparatus itself. But Escobar introduced a variable that differentiated him from almost any criminal enterprise before him.
What was that?
He deployed violence, not just for market share, but as an instrument of direct political warfare.
Right. Most syndicates want to avoid the state. They want to operate quietly in the background and just make money. Escobar decided to go to war with the state.
The Colombian state, heavily pressured by the U.S., threatened to extradite Escobar and his associates. In response, Escobar engaged in a campaign of narco-terrorism that pushed Colombia to the brink of a failed state.
He practically held the country hostage.
He systematically assassinated the Minister of Justice, multiple presidential candidates, Supreme Court justices, and thousands of police officers. He bombed commercial airliners and government buildings.
He used violence to basically veto public policy. He forced the government to rewrite the Constitution to ban extradition. It is the ultimate manifestation of criminal leverage.
But that centralized, hyper-visible model eventually became his undoing. By concentrating so much power and waging open war, he made himself a single point of failure. The combined weight of the U.S. and Colombian governments eventually dismantled the Medellin structure.
Which brings us geographically, but more importantly structurally, to the Mexican model. Because the cartels that inherited the supply chain organizations like Sinaloa, the Gulf Cartel, Azetes, they learned from Escobar's failure. They didn't centralize.
No, the Mexican illicit economy operates in a fundamentally different structural environment. It is highly fragmented and intensely competitive.
Instead of one vertically integrated monopoly,
You have shifting alliances of multiple heavily armed syndicates competing for the exact same vital logistical choke points, specifically the border crossings into the United States.
And let's apply the economic theory we discussed earlier regarding Sicily. When a criminal market lacks a monopoly, when you have multiple firms competing in the same territory without an overarching commission to resolve disputes peacefully, what is the inevitable outcome?
Catastrophic violence. Border plazas like Tijuana, Juarez, and Nuevo Laredo are worth billions of dollars in transit fees. If the Sinaloa cartel wants to move product through a plaza controlled by a rival, they cannot negotiate a treaty in court.
They have to physically conquer the territory.
The friction of that competition generates a body count that rivals active war zones. The Mexican government documented over 350,000 homicides between 2006 and 2021, driven largely by this fragmented cartel warfare.
350,000, that is staggering.
It is. But the structural evolution doesn't stop at violence. If we look at the contemporary research from sociologists who spend time on the ground in these contested regions like Veridiana Rios and Guadalupe Correa Cabrera, we see these cartels evolving back into the role of the Sicilian Gabelati.
But armed with military-grade weaponry and surveillance drones.
Exactly.
This is where it gets surreal. If I'm reading their findings right, Mexican cartels aren't just smuggling drugs anymore. They are taxing legitimate businesses and fixing potholes. They're acting like a shadow government.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it makes perfect sense. They are embedding themselves into the very fabric of municipal governance. They are taxing legitimate businesses, avocado farmers, lime growers, mining companies.
They are essentially levying an illicit property tax.
But what is truly fascinating from an institutional perspective is how they manage the populations under their control. A purely parasitic organization that only extracts wealth and murders civilians will eventually face a violent insurgency from the local population.
You can't just squeeze people forever.
Right. To maintain stability, they have to provide a return on that taxation.
So they start acting like a government. During the pandemic, we saw cartels distributing food rations branded with their logos.
Yeah.
They enforce local curfews to stop petty crime. They literally pave roads and fix potholes in rural municipalities that the federal government has completely abandoned.
They are curating public approval. They are establishing de facto sovereignty. In regions where the formal state is functionally absent, the cartel becomes the state. They provide the protection, they levy the taxes, and they build the infrastructure.
We've traced a terrifying escalation here. We saw the mob fill a power vacuum in Sicily. We saw them corrupt the political machinery in 1920s America. We saw Escobar try to physically break the state in Colombia. And we see cartels replacing the state in pockets of Mexico.
It's a clear trajectory.
But there is one final evolution. What happens when the criminal syndicate and the sovereign state undergo a complete corporate merger?
We turn our attention to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the modern Russian kleptocracy.
Set the scene for us. It's the early 1990s, the Iron Curtain falls, the Soviet command economy evaporates overnight, and suddenly, the largest transfer of public wealth in human history begins.
The privatization of Soviet state assets in the 1990s was an economic free-for-all of unprecedented scale. You had massive industrial complexes, oil fields in Siberia, aluminum smelters, metallurgical plants worth hundreds of billions of dollars suddenly being auctioned out to private individuals.
But this transition to capitalism happened without any of the legal infrastructure that capitalism actually requires.
None of it. The communist legal system was dismantled. And a functional capitalist legal system, corporate courts, regulatory agencies, property rights enforcement, did not yet exist.
It was an absolute institutional vacuum, the ultimate Wild West.
Imagine you are an aspiring oligarch in 1994. Through a combination of bribery and rigged auctions, you managed to acquire the title to a multi-billion-dollar aluminum plant.
Okay.
But a rival oligarch decides he wants that plant. He shows up with armed men to take the factory floor.
I can't call the police. They haven't been paid in 6 months and are entirely corrupt. I can't file an injunction in court because the judges are bought or terrified.
Precisely. To defend your property claim, you must deploy private violence. The distinction between a legitimate corporate raider and a criminal syndicate boss just evaporated. Both required specialized armed organizations to physically enforce their economic interests.
And the research really zeroes in on how this shadow enforcement market was staffed. Mafias don't just magically appear out of thin air just because a region is poor.
No, the structural analysis points to a very specific requirement, which Federico Varese outlines brilliantly. It's human capital.
Human capital.
For a protection market to function, you need a highly skilled supply of enforcers. When the Soviet Union collapsed, hundreds of thousands of highly trained individuals, KGB operatives, Spetsnaz, special forces, military intelligence officers, Afghan war veterans, were suddenly unemployed, stripped of their pensions, and socially marginalized.
Oh, wow. So you have a massive labor pool uniquely trained in violence, surveillance, and tactical logistics sitting right next to an explosive demand for private corporate enforcement.
It was an inevitable synergy. These former state operatives formed the backbone of the Voroy-Zakon, the Russian mafia, and the private security firms that service the oligarchs. They became the violent regulators of the new Russian economy.
But as we move from the chaotic 1990s into the era of Vladimir Putin, the dynamic shifts again, doesn't it? It's no longer a fragmented war of oligarchs. The state reasserts itself, but not as a neutral arbiter of law.
Correct. The modern Russian state operates as a kleptocracy. The formal boundaries between state intelligence apparatuses, the executive branch, and transnational organized crime have become fluid to the point of non-existence.
So instead of the mob buying off a politician, like in 1920 Chicago, the mob IS the politician. It's like a corporate merger where the criminal syndicate acquired the government.
That is exactly what political scientists mean when they label it a kleptocracy. State power protects the economic interests of a select group of politically loyal businessmen.
And conversely, when the state needs something done that it cannot do officially, it outsources the job to organized crime.
Exactly. If the Kremlin needs plausible deniability, whether it's laundering vast sums of money through Western real estate, executing cyber attacks against foreign infrastructure, or assassinating dissidents a broad way, organized crime networks are deployed as asymmetrical instruments of statecraft.
The distinction between the two has completely vanished.
It is the ultimate manifestation of criminal logistics absorbed into state power.
Okay, we need to take a massive step back and just look at the whole board. Let's take a breath.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We just traversed 19th century agrarian Sicily, the immigrant slums of 1920 Chicago, the jungles of 1980s Colombia, the modern borderlands of Mexico, and the post-Soviet industrial ruins of Russia.
Quite the tour.
The cultures, the languages, the legal systems, and the geographies of these places share almost nothing in common. Yet this identical, ruthlessly efficient shadow corporate structure keeps spontaneously generating everywhere. Why?
Because it is not a cultural phenomenon. It is a structural inevitability. Organized crime is an economic equation. When you input certain variables, the syndicate is the guaranteed output.
Let's break down the variables of that inevitable equation. What is condition one?
Condition one is the criminalization of high-demand markets. Whether a government prohibits alcohol, narcotics, gambling, or the movement of human labor across borders, the legislative act does not erase the human demand.
Right. People still want it.
It simply shifts the supply side into the shadows, creates a massive risk premium, and subsidizes organizations that specialize in violent contract enforcement.
And the data is conclusive across all historical models, isn't it? When the variables change, the output changes.
Without fail. Look at the end of Prohibition in the United States. The moment the state began regulating and taxing alcohol, the violent bootlegging cartels were eradicated from that market. They simply could not compete with the logistical efficiency and lower prices of legal breweries operating without a risk premium.
We see the modern equivalent in Portugal.
Exactly. Portugal decriminalized the personal possession of all drugs in 2001. By treating narcotics as a public health issue rather than a criminal market, they drastically shrank the illicit economy.
They removed the risk premium.
Yes. Drug-related violence plummeted, HIV transmission rates collapsed, and the structural power of street-level syndicates was severely degraded. Prohibition guarantees criminal supply, regulation dismantles it.
And what is condition two of the equation?
Weak, corrupt, or fundamentally distrusted formal institutions. If you look at a global heat map of organized crime density, it perfectly overlays the geography of weak governance. Syndicates take root where the state is unable or unwilling to provide baseline security and dispute resolution.
Applying this directly to the listener's perspective, think about this. If your neighborhood doesn't trust the police and a dispute happens or someone steals your livelihood, who do you call? Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does economics. You are forced to seek alternative justice.
You seek a localized power broker, whether it's southern Italy, parts of Mexico, or marginalized American cities. Organized crime only takes root in the soil of weak or corrupt formal governance.
It is a symptom of institutional failure.
Exactly. It is a highly rational, entrepreneurial response to a broken environment. It is not a moral failing of the local population. It is the brutal economics of survival.
Which brings me to a profound contradiction. If all of this is true, that organized crime is basically a bureaucratic, structural economic response full of spreadsheet logistics, risk premiums, and supply chain management, why do we picture glamorous men in suits kissing rings and talking about family honor? We need to talk about the Hollywood filter.
Yes, popular culture acts as a sunhouse mirror. It distorts the structural reality while selectively amplifying certain aesthetic truths. We are dealing with some of the most influential media ever created. The Godfather, Goodfellas, The Sopranos.
The aesthetic execution of these movies is flawless, but sociologically, what are these narratives actually doing to our perception? I think the academic term for it is selective authenticity.
Selective authenticity. It means the filmmakers meticulously recreate the procedural details of the underworld. The cadence of the dialogue, the cut of the suits, the specific rituals of the making ceremony, all of it is rendered with stunning documentary precision.
They get the rituals exactly right.
But they take those authentic details and wrap them in a narrative framework that imposes a dramatic moral logic that is completely absent in reality.
They film a fundamentally parasitic bureaucracy as if it were a tragic romance.
Let's analyze The Godfather. Francis Ford Coppola created a masterpiece that profoundly shaped global culture. But fundamentally, it champions Don Corleone as an avatar of authentic masculinity, fierce familial loyalty, and old-world tradition.
He is presented in sharp contrast to the sterile, corrupt, hypocritical institutions of modern America, right? The politicians, the police, the legal system. He is the honorable outlaw.
But that romanticization is deeply deceptive. It functions as a critique of corporate capitalism by presenting the Mafia family as a noble alternative. Yet it systematically hides the mundane brutality required to sustain that family.
It leaves out the ugly parts.
It elides the daily extortion of working-class butchers, the loan sharking that destroys families, the localized terror. It transforms a predatory protection racket into a chivalric order defending the neighborhood.
It makes us root for the parasite. Is there any piece of pop culture that actually succeeds in showing the true structural mechanics without the romance?
The singular standout in the sociological literature is HBO's The Wire.
An absolute masterpiece of television. But why does it succeed where others fail?
Because it refuses to romanticize the individual. The Wire analyzes the criminal drug organizations in Baltimore and the city's police department through the exact same structural, unromantic analytical lens.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It demonstrates how individuals on both sides of the law are completely trapped by the bureaucratic mandates, the economic pressures, and the institutional incentives of their respective organizations.
There are no noble heroes and purely evil villains. There are just middle managers trying to satisfy the demands of the institution, whether that institution is a drug cartel demanding higher yields on a street corner, or a police department demanding better arrest statistics for a mayoral campaign.
It perfectly captures the banality of the illicit enterprise. It is about logistics, market share, and institutional survival.
This massive cultural footprint leads to something I find endlessly fascinating. We don't just consume the media. We have actively absorbed their corporate jargon into our daily lives. So, what does this all mean for how we speak today? The migration of criminal argot into mainstream English is staggering.
The vocabulary of the underworld has entirely infiltrated mainstream discourse.
Let's look at some examples. We use mob constantly. We talk about a front, like a legitimate business concealing something else.
A fence for someone receiving stolen goods. Hitman, made man, whack, muscle, rat.
We literally use their corporate jargon. Think about how often people in perfectly legal, boring office jobs use this terminology. If a marketing manager talks about their new side hustle or complains that the new software subscription is a racket, they are deploying literal mafia vocabulary to describe their Tuesday afternoon.
The etymology is revealing. Racket originally referred specifically to the coercive noise and chaos created by gangs to extort protection money.
Oh, wow, the noise.
Yeah. Now it just means a fraudulent scheme or an annoying business practice. Hustle, historically referred to illicit, illegal activity pimping, drug dealing, numbers running. Today, in the era of gig economy, grind culture, a side hustle is celebrated as a marker of energetic entrepreneurial virtue.
Why do we do this? Why does mainstream law-abiding society so eagerly adopt the language of violent criminals?
Primarily, it's the cultural fascination generated by the media we just discussed. But linguistically, these words entered standard English because they're incredibly vivid, economical, and punchy.
They have real weight to them.
They carry a residual authority. Consider the environment where these words were forged. In a criminal syndicate, language is a matter of life and death. The distinction between a civilian and a rat is the difference between breathing and getting a bullet in the back of the head.
That's intense.
When a term is born in that crucible of absolute consequence, it carries a unique, dangerous cultural weight. Mainstream speakers find that residual danger intoxicating. It allows them to borrow a tiny fraction of that outlaw aesthetic for their own mundane lives.
We want to feel just a little bit dangerous when we talk about our hustle selling handmade soaps on Etsy. It's a kind of linguistic cosplay.
Exactly. It's an adoption of the aesthetic without any of the actual risk.
Well, this has been a truly phenomenal paradigm shift. Let's pull all these threads together and summarize the journey for you, the listener. Organized crime is not a chaotic rebellion against the rules of society. It is a dark, highly structured mirror of it.
A very dark mirror.
It is a rational economic response that steps in to enforce contracts and provide governance when the formal state fails, whether that is the agrarian transition of 19th century Sicily, the post-Soviet industrial ruins, or the neglected municipalities of modern Mexico. It thrives precisely on the prohibition of high-demand goods, leveraging the risk premium to accumulate massive capital.
And ultimately, it organizes itself using the exact same economic logic as the legal corporations that manufacture our cars and phones.
Which brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with today to mull over. Something to think about the next time you watch a cinematic masterpiece about the mob, or perhaps the next time you read the financial news.
Okay, let's hear it.
We have established that organized crime is simply a rational economic response, acting outside the law to establish a monopoly and enforce its own protection. But at what point does a hyper-successful, perfectly legal multinational corporation, one that actively deploys billions of dollars in lobbying to change federal laws, write its own tax loopholes, crush emerging competition, and legally protect its own monopolies, stop being a regular business and start resembling a legally sanctioned cartel? If the people writing the laws are the exact same entities selling you the protection, where exactly is the line between a legitimate enterprise and a protection racket?
That is the stressful friction we all have to navigate. It is a profound question of institutional power.
Keep questioning the world around you, look past the Hollywood filters, and examine the structures governing your own life. We will see you on the next Deep Dive.